Those people get 4s and 5s, but you do your job. You do only your job. You come in, you leave on time, whatever, and you are phenomenal at it.
Right.
So you get a 3.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. This is Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And this is episode 98, which means we are bearing down on episode 100.
Yes, we are.
Dun, dun, dun.
It's a runaway train.
We have a couple conversations going on in the Facebook group about that. We are probably going to be including some messages from listeners as well as recordings from listeners, either talking about how you celebrate milestones, how you acknowledge your milestones. Also, we may have a thread going on about favorite episodes. So all those things may get woven in. If you have anything you want to contribute to that, you can either email us at talktous@sohere'smystory.com, or you can text or leave a voicemail at 410-205-6055.
Nice.
Speaking of the Facebook group, big welcome to Chris Caruso, who is our newest member. Hopefully we'll be hearing more from her in just a little bit here. So Elliot tells a story today. We focus on feedback and how to get it, what to do with it when you pay attention to it, when you ignore it, how to get better feedback, and all sorts of things like that.
And also, not to be missed, how to practice saying the phrase, statistically significant. Here we go. So here's my story. I was doing a workshop for our client on their contracts. I was teaching a number of their high-level executives really about their contracts and how to decipher all the legalese. And then one of the exercises was showing them how to, I know this sounds odd, but how to write an email or communicate during the job so that you can make your point, you can protect your interests, but you preserve the relationship. And if everything goes south and this email becomes Exhibit 1, how it doesn't torpedo your case or create a bad impression in front of a judge or an arbitrator.
Oh, I love that because that's why there's two of us, because that first part, like, I know how to do that. That second part, probably not so good.
Well, you probably
I just don't have the lens for it. Like, I don't know what not. I don't know those boundaries. Anyway,
right.
Sorry.
Well, and if you've been in court enough times and seen somebody wave a piece of paper around, not because of the substance, but just because of the effect of the words,
sure,
and it just casts one of the parties or the other in a really bad light. Anyway, so that's what I was trying to teach. Mm-hmm. Something that could be easily digestible by the other side and also by a judge if need be. And the point is that obviously after the workshops, we distribute the evaluation forms because I obviously want to find out what works, what doesn't work, what could be improved, all of those things. And I ask specific questions, and two of them are, what exercise did you find the most beneficial? What exercise did you find the least beneficial, and why? And I was going over the evaluation forms afterwards with the person who had invited me and has had me do several workshops for their company. And he just started to laugh. He was looking at them first because the first evaluation form that just happened to be on top of the pile said that the writing exercise on how to do an email that accomplishes those goals of protecting your interests and preserving the relationship, he found that to be the least beneficial because we already know how to write emails, and it was fine. It was a good activity. Gotcha. It's a good reminder, but we know how to do this. It's not a big deal. And the second evaluation form was, no, we found this to be the most beneficial. The writing the emails we really need.
Oh, the same thing.
Same exact
so
exercise.
Flip-flopped.
They flipped it.
Uh-huh.
Now, what my client was laughing at most was not only the fact that how can you learn anything from these feedback forms, particularly when you have a low number of people? It's just a small workshop.
Right. It's like there were 700 people giving feedback.
It's a workshop where you had, 11 people actively engaged in it, but the size was limited. So how can you learn anything when person A says, I loved this, and person B says, I hate this about the exact same thing? And the second part of it is that he was stunned that anybody thought that was the email writing was the least beneficial, because it was so obvious to him and to me during the exercise that they committed all of the sins we were trying to avoid, and they desperately needed to learn how, not the content. They knew the content. They know their area.
Sure.
But they desperately needed to learn how to write it diplomatically and with the overarching theme in mind that would not cast you in a bad light, either with the other side or with the judge.
Meaning that like when they did the exercise in the workshop, even with your direction, like their version of, oh yeah, I did that thing. Here's the thing. It still wasn't.
It was horrible. It was.
How did you feel about it?
Not
Elliot?
good. I realized I had to go back.
Did you say, that's horrible?
Well, no, because it's hard to teach diplomacy and not be diplomatic.
Yeah, okay.
But I did make that activity. I almost had to double it in length because it was apparent to me how far from the goal that they felt. Not because, and again, I want to emphasize this, not because they're stupid or it was really because it's not the way of communication in their world. And they thought from the way they communicate, just like lawyers can be very blunt and they thought the way they were communicating was fine, and I had to change that. And they a number of them couldn't perceive that there was a
difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little bit like me with colors, and then it's not a tangent, right? You know, I have a friend who's got this really, and actually so is my husband, who's an architect. He's got this really like much broader and nuanced sense of color than I do. And he'll be like, well, see how this red has more purple in it and this red has more green or whatever in it. And I'm like,
that's cool.
No.
I can't do that.
Yeah,
that's cool.
I don't see that. I can see like darker or lighter or brighter, or I can see orange. I can say like, yeah, that's an orangier red, but that's about it. So what is that called? Like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you can't perceive your lack of understanding in something.
Yes.
So they couldn't even see the purple, the shade that you were pointing out in the difference between, they're like, well, here, I did that thing. You're like, no, that thing should look like this. And they're probably like, yeah, that's what I did. I did that thing. You're like, no.
Yeah, I did red. No, you did burgundy. It's red. No, it's burgundy.
No, exactly.
But there's a big difference between the two.
Well, but I want to come back to the original point of this feedback piece, not to just mock some people trying to learn something. It sounds like a terrible episode. Because that's not the point here. It's the feedback that you get. So when I was doing facilitation school, the classes that I took for facilitation training, rather, when we were learning about feedback and whatnot, this really landed with me where the lady said, it's good to get the feedback. It's good to use it. Although I want to make a couple other comments on that. But she said, but you always have to remember that feedback says way more about the person giving it than it does about you. Yeah. And I think that's really profound, because it doesn't mean ignore their feedback. I mean, because otherwise don't waste your time getting feedback. Correct. If you're just going to dump it in the shredder. But it also means you can't gobble down every bite as, inarguable truth.
Yes.
It's just like, it's a piece of a puzzle that you're like, especially when you get conflicting, because statistically significant, when you have a small number of people, it's hard for it to prove anything. This one says yes, that one says no, this one says up, that one says down. Right. So trying to find like the truth in it, I think is a tricky thing. And you have to also then factor in that person can only see what that person can see, and they may not be in a place where they can quite understand that they need that improvement. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to see, because obviously there are a number of different learning styles. People consume content differently. And when I walk in to give a talk or give a workshop, I don't know how all of the attendees consume content. So it's useful to me to find out if this didn't land or that didn't land. It might not be that it wasn't a useful point. It would just be that, I have to kind of make it nuance or add a wrinkle to it or something. But
or that you were doing it entirely just by talking about it, and someone needed a visual, or, they needed like a graphic or something to like land it, or. Right. Yeah.
But to your point, if I have this workshop, and I think it's a really good workshop, but I will wait until I've given it 3, 4, 5 times and get all of those evaluation forms back, particularly when attendance is always going to be limited in a workshop, where I can get critical mass. Yeah. And then I can really evaluate it.
Well, right. Because I think what's really risky is, a couple things happen. Anytime you get feedback, it's hard to not... I think you have to fight the urge to take it personally, or even like, well, you didn't understand how important that is. It does basically somebody saying this thing doesn't have value, and that we have like a fight or flight, whether we like it or not. It elicits a response in us. So, but
this is why I did it.
Yeah, but there was a reason. But I think once you have that feedback, though, then you feel like, well, I either have to ignore it or do something with it. But to your point, not until you know that it's actually a thing. I see companies, forget whether we're talking about like like a workshop or something where you're getting very distinct feedback, but you can have somebody, I've seen a lot of zigs and zags and swerves in leadership decisions based on, well, so-and-so didn't like this, so we're totally changing this. And it's like, well, okay, maybe, but what if that's a very distinct issue? What if that's not what needs to happen? And yet figuring out where the critical mass is really tricky. There are a couple of softwares that services that I subscribe to where there are threads and threads and threads of people complaining about this one technical issue that's a huge hurdle that keeps you from being able to use it in whole industries. It's an e-commerce app, and you can't do units in decimals, which means if you have any
really?
kind of,
Wow.
So like if you sell like food that's by the pound or something, you can either do 1 pound or 2 pounds.
That's
you can't do 1.25 pounds or something like that. And their solution is, well, just change it to ounces. And I'm like, no. No, because even that 1 ounce, 2 ounce, if you're selling cheese, like really expensive cheese, that doesn't work, So it's really limiting. And there's threads and threads and threads about it, and they're just not responding. So I'm like, but they're adding other sorts of like bells and whistles of things. I'm like, where, like, are we not critical massy enough for you? But this is a huge, huge, huge issue. So I think that like when feedback becomes when to use it and when to throw it out, and we're listing lots of reasons to not pay attention to it. So then I come back to this question, why, it sounds rhetorical, but it's not. Like, why ask for feedback? What's important about it?
Well, the first thing, I do want to know what each person is thinking, because while it may be statistically invalid, so to speak, to take one person's feedback, if that one piece of feedback is, I really need it in ounces, it might reveal something like, oh, I never thought of that. And then it can, and then you get this larger truth. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Even if only one person says it. Yeah, that's right. If we're going to appeal to the food service industry, yes, that's a big thing. So there's a different kind of feedback. If somebody says this was the exercise I found to be less beneficial, I'd want to find critical mass on that. But if somebody says, I didn't understand the directions at all, I really could, one person saying that, I have to look carefully at what that was.
No, that's a great distinction. How would you articulate that distinction? Like, one of those is, it's not just the different, because the first I heard it, like, I liked this, didn't like this, and I struggled to keep up with you. So that's a little bit of the distinction, but it feels like that's not the only way those two things are different.
I'll tell you, and this may or may not be the response. This is what came to my mind in law, in a complicated contract. And let's say that there's a company that's being sold. I
love when we get to go into complicated contracts.
I know you do. I know it's your favorite. Just like my children's series. So you have a series of representations that one side will make to the other. This is true. That's true. But within that, you have what's known as fundamental representations.
Okay.
The fundamental representations, I may say, if I'm selling the stock in my company, I may say, we have no reason to believe that a customer will leave us. Okay?
Okay.
That's something that it's important to the buyer to know. But that's not fundamental. Fundamental representation is, I own the stock I'm selling you.
Oh, I see. So a little bit difference between sort of opinion and fact.
And there are certain things that are strict, absolute liability. You have to have this. The deal can't go forward. There's no gray area. Then this is a fundamental point. It just like in the workshop, I didn't understand I didn't know the instructions. I didn't understand what the point was. This went completely over my head. That seems more fundamental than, well, I didn't find this to be as valuable as the other 4 exercises we did. Right.
One's like a rating versus that was lost to me. I can't even comment because I don't know what that thing was.
We had a 5-hour workshop, and at least 30 minutes of that, I could have been counting ceiling tiles because I didn't understand. That to me is fundamental.
I kind of, because it's funny when I ask for feedback of things, I've noticed that, and I ask that question, why I get it, because sometimes I'm like, you don't, it's not like you go back and rewrite the whole recipe of what you do with feedback. So why do you ask for it? But here's what I've come to for myself. I read feedback, or reviews of things that I do for clients, kind of the same way I read horoscopes. Like I read them, and if they either validate something that I already had a hunch about, or make me go, oh, like I feel like something that I feel like calls out a blind spot. Those things I take from it, and I kind of leave the blur in the middle. It's a very intuitive process. I would not be able to articulate like what kind of pops out at me and what, if I read horoscopes, I'm like, well, that doesn't feel like it applies to me. It just brushes off. Now, interestingly, and this is what I think is fascinating about this feedback conversation. It is entirely possible that you and I have gotten feedback that perks on that whole Dunning-Kruger effect, that somebody is saying something to us that we just can't even see the purple in it because we're just not there in that place to see that shade of what they're pointing at for us. So, you always might be missing something. Well, but you can't deal with that if you can't see it yet. If somebody, as people have said, as somebody says to us, your show seems really unscripted. And we're like, yes, it is. Yep. Now, there may be a burgundy versus brick versus red versus whatever distinction in there that they're laying down that we're not picking up. Could be. Although on that one, I would say that's a conscious choice. It is. We don't want to have a it is, but one. This seems, there might be something that they're taking away. But yeah, there may be that blind spot to the feedback. If I stick with that for a second, our show is unscripted, but I know that I consciously, as we're talking, will often kind of circle us back to, we started this on feedback because I wanted to kind of go into like the email conversation. I was like, no, wait, we're looking at this topic through the lens of feedback today. And so there is actually, I don't know if I'd call it a structure, but there is there's a channeling of some sort to keep it within a certain lane. That is very distinct from we start talking about completely random things and end up somewhere completely random. I mean, okay, that also happens. No, but it's unscripted, but it's not improv. It's not improv. And I think, actually I would call it improv. Okay, we don't need to make that distinction right now. But I think what's important, where I was going with that is, like if I wasn't conscious of that nuance that I just spoke to, of like, I do pull us back and make sure we stay somehow on that original theme, then someone else to another unscripted show that also wants to be unscripted, maybe that's what that feedback for that show would be hungering for. It's like, I don't need it to be scripted, but I just want some kind of structure so it's not just anywhere, everywhere, and not tying it all back together into one thought. And I only point that out because that's a nuance that's said in the words scripted versus unscripted, which our show and somebody else's show might both be unscripted, but ours may have a thread of structure to it that's not on the other one. And that is a finer point that sort of falls into that purple category we keep talking about. And that's what I was mentioning. But some of it it was when we were talking about what's statistically valid, what's statistically not. So hard to say statistically. Statistically not. Yeah. Statistically. Well, it says statistically valid. Yeah, just don't try to say statistically significant. That's what I was looking for, statistically significant. But anyway, so like I have for teaching at Towson, you have evaluations and that's fine. But you also have the ratings on the website called Rate My Professor. Oh, yeah. That last forever, apparently. Yes. And so you only go on to check and see if you have the chili pepper, right? I do. Which I go on to check, but I do not. If you're not familiar, it's whether a professor is hot or not, which is not the point of the site. But which is an odd thing to me, which I wouldn't find odd if I did have the chili pepper, but I don't think I did. Then I'd be touting its accuracy. But if you go down the ratings, because I was looking at them the other day, if you go down, there's one rating. I have one rating that's a 1-star rating. And all it said, he's mean. He's not nice at all. But you could give a speech about your cat and still get an A. What? And I thought, well, if it's a good speech about your cat, I guess you could. That's also super weird because how are you mean and not nice, but you're an easy A? Those two things don't make sense together. But the whole thing is that, and they do allow you, which I've never done. It says, oh, are you Ellie Wenger? You can log in, I guess, to have your 2 minutes for rebuttal. And I'm like, I'm not going to rebut this or whatever. Cats are cool, Cats are cool. If it's a good cat speech. What do you got against cats? But
I imagine somebody looking down the whole rate my professor thing, trying to decide between two classes, is this a class they want to take? And I do have feedback. And when I looked at that, I dismissed it immediately because I don't think I'm mean, and I don't believe that's true. But
plus, mean is such a subjective.
It's so subjective.
Now, where they said he's mean, he says he wants one thing, but then he grades on something else. You're like,
right.
Oh, that's different.
That's exactly my point. If the feedback were, I think that the grading criteria is unclear, or I believe that I really wish I had learned this and he didn't teach that. Well, then I'd really pause and I'd think, well, is that true? And what do I have to do? Maybe I would decide, no, I think I'm good on that. But I would certainly pause and look over, even if it is not statistically significant and only one person said it.
Right.
I could pause and say,
I love that. Yeah, there can be an outlier comment that can be somebody who sees something that not a lot of people see, or they're just the first person who's been willing to actually speak to it. So it doesn't have to have statistical significance to be valuable. Look at me. I got all the way through that. I saw the most interesting thing. I
just see the title of this is going to be statistical significance, and only because we've been toying with that phrase throughout the entire episode.
Whole episode. I was doing this recommendation evaluation kind of form for this leadership program for someone who was applying to this year-long leadership thing. And it was like 4 or 5 pages of the Likert scale, 1 through 5 or whatever, of would you say this person is this or this? And those are always so hard because I'm like, well, I don't know. I think so, blah, blah, blah. So I went all the way through. And then this was fascinating. I've never seen any other survey do this, and I don't know why they don't. It said, now think, it was just the one page at the end. Now think of the best leader that you know of, the most, whatever, the leader you respect most, and answer these 10 questions. And they were kind of similar-ish questions, your basic thing. Do you do this? Do you do that? Do you know why I think they do that?
To see what your baseline is.
To see what my baseline is. Because what if I'm someone who the best leader I've ever encountered, I would give a 4 just because I'm someone who would never give a 5.
Only God is perfect.
Right. Like I just whereas if I'm like 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, and I rated this other person 3s and 4s, then you know something about it. But if a 3 or a 4 is my 5, you have to know what's their thing. And I think about
That's
that
great.
I know, right? And I've never seen other things baseline like that. And it's pretty simple. And it's not, it's one more thing to kind of factor in there, but I think it's really, really valuable to find a way to baseline that feedback against that person's life view. I mean, when you read Amazon reviews, there's some people I read the review of something and I'm like, you're just an unhappy person. I think that. Those are things that just seem, kind of light touch, and you're very dissatisfied. But
the baseline is something incredibly important. And I know I'm opening up something that we're going to shut down really quickly because it could be a whole nother episode. But when you look at, personnel evaluations, as we've talked about, you could have somebody who thinks that the person in front of them does a fabulous job, but gives them only a 3. And the reason, I've had these conversations with people, the reason is they do a fabulous job, but all they're doing is exactly what their job description is. And I reserve a 4 and a 5 for people who go beyond their actual job responsibilities and organize the charity drive or organize, even though that's not their job. So those people get 4s and 5s, but you do your job. You do only your job. You come in, you leave on time, whatever, and you are phenomenal at it.
Right.
So you get a 3. But,
Yeah, that's part of I'm not a big fan of personal evaluations in that format. And that's part of the reason. That question should say, how is this person at specifically what their job description?
Correct.
And a different question, do they go above and beyond? Give them a 1 on that and a 5 on the other. But the fact that
a matter of baseline.
It's interpretive.
It's interpretive. And then somebody looks at it and says, a 3, I'm just average and I'm not going to.
And often they'll not try as hard. They don't appreciate how hard I'm trying. So why should I go to that extra effort? It's because your eyes just simply scan for the highs and the lows when you see those kinds of things. You're up and down.
And so on that note, because our eyes do scan for the highs and the lows, if you can go to iTunes and rate us at a 5, that would be incredibly appreciated.
Nicely done,
Thank you.
Elliot.
I know,
wow.
right? I'm on fire today.
You are on fire today. You can find us at www.sohere'smystory.com.
That's right. And the more ratings we get of 5, the more statistically valid they will be.
Nice.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.